A broken human recording had been playing on loop inside the listening station for almost a year. It was an old song, full of static, about hope during a storm. Nobody knew why it kept repeating. Dorian Vale never turned it off. He liked the sound of it, even though he did not fully understand the words. Dorian had spent 15 years on this station, far from the busy Corvette worlds, doing a job most people thought was boring. He listened to signals from a small blue planet called Earth. At first, it was just noise, old broadcasts, strange music, arguments on television, children laughing in videos nobody meant to send into space. Over time, it became something else. Dorian began to understand humans. Not just their weapons or their ships, but their stories, their mistakes, and the strange way they kept helping each other even after terrible wars among themselves. He wrote reports about this. Long, detailed reports, full of examples. He explained how humans had fought 2 massive wars on their own planet, yet still built hospitals, treaties, and shelters for strangers. He explained how their history was full of both cruelty and kindness, but the kindness kept winning in the end, slowly, again and again. He believed this mattered. He believed it was the most important thing anyone could know about this species. Nobody on the Corvette Directorate cared about his opinion. Not until the humans started building colonies past their home system. Then, suddenly, everyone cared. The Corvette War Council called an emergency session. Dorian was ordered to attend, not as a guest, but as the expert witness who would confirm what everyone already believed, that humanity was dangerous and needed to be stopped before it grew stronger. The council chamber was cold and quiet, lit by pale blue light. Administrator Kessa Rose sat at the highest point of the room, her sharp eyes moving over every officer present. She was known across Corvette space for one belief. Any species capable of destroying itself was capable of destroying others. She had built her entire career on this idea, and humanity, in her mind, was the perfect example. You have studied them longer than anyone alive, Kessa said, looking directly at Dorian. Tell the council what you have learned. Tell them what humanity truly is. Dorian stood in the center of the chamber, aware that every officer was waiting for him to say the words they wanted to hear. He did not say them. Humans have fought many wars, Dorian said. But every time they had the chance to destroy themselves completely, they chose not to. Every time they had the power to erase another group of people, most of them refused. They are not perfect. They are not peaceful by nature. But they choose peace far more often than they choose destruction, especially once given a real choice. A few officers laughed quietly. Kessa did not laugh. That is not an answer, she said. That is an opinion. We asked for a threat assessment, not a philosophy lesson. Dorian did not back down. My threat assessment is this. If we attack them without reason, we will turn a species that mostly avoids war into a species that has no other option but to fight us with everything it has. That is more dangerous than leaving them alone. The chamber went silent. Then Kessa stood, and her voice filled the room. We do not have the luxury of waiting to find out if you are right, she said. History has taught us that mercy shown too early leads to disaster later. This council does not exist to take that risk. She called for a vote. Officer after officer raised their hand in favor of a first strike against the human colonies, a war designed to end before humanity could grow strong enough to strike first. Dorian did not raise his hand. He was the only one in the entire chamber who refused. The strike was approved anyway. His vote meant nothing in the final count, but it was recorded, quietly, in the official record, almost as an afterthought. Nobody in that chamber believed it would ever matter again. After the vote, Kessa approached him personally. She did not look angry. She looked almost disappointed, the way someone looks at a student who failed an easy lesson. You have wasted 15 years staring at their broadcasts, she said. You have started thinking like them instead of studying them. That is a dangerous mistake for a Corvette officer to make. Dorian met her eyes without flinching. Maybe understanding them is not the same as becoming weak. Maybe it is the only reason any of us should be allowed to make decisions about their future. Kessa did not respond to that. She simply turned and walked away, already moving on to the next stage of her plan, already speaking with fleet commanders about timing and strategy. To her, the conversation was finished. The decision was made. Dorian returned to his quarters that night and sat alone with the old human recording still playing softly in the background, the same broken song about hope during a storm. He thought about the years he had spent listening to a species he had never met in person, learning their fears, their humor, their strange and constant refusal to give up on each other. He thought about the fleet that would soon be moving toward their colonies, carrying orders built on fear instead of understanding. He did not know yet how far he was willing to go to stop it. But sitting there, listening to that same worn-out song, he understood one thing clearly. He would not be part of what was coming next, no matter what it cost him. 3 weeks after the vote, Doran received a set of orders folded into his personal terminal like they were nothing special, like they were just another assignment. He was to take command of a strike group heading toward the outer human colonies. His years of studying humanity had made him valuable, useful for predicting their reactions, their defenses, their weak points. The Directorate wanted his knowledge used as a weapon. He read the orders twice, sitting alone in his quarters, the old human song no longer playing. He had turned it off the night of the vote and never turned it back on. Somehow, listening to it now felt like it would mean something different, something he was not ready to face. The next morning, he walked onto the deck of the command ship where his crew was already preparing for departure. Officer Toma Rake, young and eager, was checking navigation data with 2 other crew members near the main console. Toma had served under Doran for 3 years and respected him more than any other officer he had worked with. He looked up and gave a small nod as Doran approached. "Systems are ready, sir," Toma said. "We can leave orbit within the hour." Doran did not answer right away. He looked around the deck, at the crew preparing weapon systems built to strike colonies that, according to his own research, were mostly farms, schools, and small research posts. Then he spoke, loud enough for the entire deck to hear. "I will not be commanding this strike." The room went still. Toma turned fully toward him, confused. "Sir, I refuse this mission," Doran said. "Not because I am afraid of humans. Because what we are about to do is wrong, and it will not end the way the Council believes it will." Word spread through the ship within minutes. By the time Senior Command arrived to remove him from the deck, most of the crew already knew what had happened. Some looked at him with confusion. A few, quietly, looked at him with something closer to respect, though none of them said it out loud. Doran was arrested that same day, not with violence, but with the cold efficiency of a system that had already decided how this would go. He was brought before a smaller tribunal, not the full War Council, since Administrator Kessa Rowe did not think his case deserved that much attention anymore. He had already served his purpose as a symbol, first as an example of caution ignored, now as an example of what happened to those who resisted the will of the Directorate. "You had every opportunity to serve with honor," the tribunal officer said. "Instead, you chose cowardice in front of your own crew at the exact moment your service was needed most." Doran did not argue. He knew nothing he said would change the outcome. "I did not refuse because I am a coward," he said simply. "I refuse because I believe history will prove me right, even if none of you are willing to consider it today." His rank was stripped. His name was removed from active command records. He was sentenced to exile at a remote outpost far from any major Corvette world, a fueling and supply station considered too unimportant for anyone with real influence to care about. Before he was taken away, Kessa Rowe visited him one final time, standing just outside his holding cell. "You could have been remembered as a great officer," she said. "Instead, you will be remembered as the man who refused to fight when his people needed him most." "Maybe," Doran said quietly. "Or maybe I will be remembered as the only one who was paying attention." Kessa said nothing else. She turned and walked away, and Doran was transported to the outpost within days, stripped of everything except the memories of what he had studied for 15 years. Meanwhile, far from that quiet exile, the invasion fleet reached the outer human colonies and launched its first strike. Official reports reached Corvette Command within hours, describing total victory, minimal resistance, and colonies falling exactly as planned. Administrator Kessa Rowe used these reports to silence any remaining doubts across the Directorate, presenting the war as swift, controlled, and already nearly finished. The truth on the ground was very different. Small human defense forces, though outnumbered and poorly equipped compared to Corvette technology, refused to surrender in the organized, predictable way Corvette strategists expected. Instead of collapsing, they scattered, regrouped, adapted their tactics within days, and used the terrain and their own technology in ways that Corvette battle simulations had never accounted for. Losses on the Corvette side were quietly recorded, then quietly buried beneath official statements claiming everything was proceeding as expected. Toma Rake, still serving aboard the very ship Doran had once commanded, watched these early reports with growing unease. The numbers on his own console did not match the numbers being announced to the public. Ships listed as fully operational were, in reality, badly damaged. Casualties described as minor were, in truth, far heavier than anyone wanted to admit. He said nothing at first. He simply remembered the words Doran had spoken on that deck, the ones everyone had dismissed so quickly, and for the first time, he began to wonder if his former commander had understood something the entire War Council had refused to see. The fueling outpost smelled of hot metal and old machinery, a small station built for refueling supply convoys traveling between the front lines and the core Corvette worlds. It was not a place for officers with a future. It was a place for people the Directorate wanted to forget. Doran spent his days there checking fuel levels, logging convoy schedules, and doing work that required none of the skills he had spent 15 years developing. At night, when the station was quiet, he found himself doing the one thing nobody had ordered him to stop. He listened, not to human broadcasts anymore, since the outpost had no access to those systems, but to the supply convoys passing through, to the tired conversations of crews moving between the war and home, to the small details nobody bothered hiding from a disgraced officer nobody respected anymore. Those small details told a very different story than the one being broadcast across Corvette space. Convoys carrying repair parts moved through the outpost far more often than official reports suggested they should, given how quickly the war was supposedly ending. Medical transports arrived more frequently than expected, carrying wounded crews from battles that, according to public records, had already been won weeks earlier. Doran began keeping quiet notes, not for any official purpose, simply because old habits from 15 years of study were difficult to abandon completely. One evening, a familiar face stepped off a supply ship docking at the outpost. Toma Rake looked older than he had a year earlier, tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He spotted Doran near the fueling controls and walked over without hesitation, ignoring the awkwardness of speaking to a disgraced former commander in front of other crew members. "I did not expect to see you here," Doran said. "I did not expect to be reassigned to a supply route either," Toma answered. "After what happened at the third colony strike, a lot of us were moved around. Fewer questions that way." Doran studied him carefully. "What happened at the third colony strike?" Toma hesitated, glancing around before lowering his voice. "The official report says we secured it in 2 days with minimal resistance. That is not what happened. It took 11 days. We lost almost a third of our strike force. The humans there were farmers, mostly, with old weapons and barely any military training, and they still made us pay for every meter of ground we took." Doran felt something settle in his chest, heavy and familiar. "And the Council still believes the war is close to finished?" "The Council believes what it is told," Thomas said. "And what it is told comes from officers too afraid to report the truth, because the truth does not match what Administrator Kessa promised everyone before the war began." Over the following months, Toma returned to the outpost several times, each visit bringing more fragments of the real war, pieced together slowly like a puzzle nobody in command wanted solved. Human colonies that should have fallen easily kept resisting far longer than predicted. Small, improvised human ships, built from whatever materials were available, kept finding ways to damage far more advanced Corvette vessels through unpredictable maneuvers and desperate creativity. More surprising than the resistance itself was something else Toma described one night, quietly, almost as if he did not fully believe it himself. "During the 5th colony strike, our forces captured a group of Corvette soldiers who had been stranded after a failed retreat," Toma said. "We assumed they were dead or taken as prisoners of war, treated the way our own doctrine treats captured enemies. Instead, the human colonists gave them food, treated their wounds, and eventually returned them through a neutral channel, along with a message asking why we had attacked people who never threatened them." Doran said nothing for a long moment. It was exactly what he had told the War Council, word for word, the same behavior he had studied for 15 years, now proven true in the middle of an active war. Not because humans were weak or naive, but because their choice to show mercy, even to enemies, kept appearing again and again, exactly as history had shown. Nobody in command wants to hear this, Thomas said quietly. It does not fit the story they built the entire war around. It never will, Dorrance said. Not until the cost becomes too high for them to keep pretending otherwise. That cost was already growing. Convoys of wounded crews continued arriving at the outpost. Requests for replacement pilots and repair parts increased steadily, month after month. Officers passing through spoke less confidently than they had a year earlier, their conversations quieter, their eyes more tired. Doran kept his notes, small fragments of a truth being hidden from an entire civilization. He did not know yet whether any of it would matter, whether a disgraced officer at a forgotten fueling station could ever change the direction of a war already so far underway. But for the first time since his exile began, he allowed himself a small, careful hope that the truth, once it became impossible to hide, might finally be heard. 2 years into the war, the fueling outpost that once handled a handful of quiet supply convoys had become one of the busiest stations along the entire front line. Doran barely recognized the place anymore. What had been a slow, forgotten post was now packed with repair crews working around the clock, medical transports arriving faster than they could be unloaded, and officers moving through with expressions that had long since lost any confidence about how the war was going. The public story had not changed. Corvette broadcasts still described steady progress, careful victories, and a war moving toward its planned conclusion. Administrator Kessa Rose still appeared regularly in official announcements, calm and certain, promising that human resistance was weakening and that the Directorate's strategy remained exactly on schedule. The numbers passing through Doran Station told a very different story, one that could no longer be hidden through careful wording alone. Human forces had stopped fighting as isolated, scattered colonies. Somewhere during the second year of the war, they had begun coordinating with other species the Corvette Directorate had also targeted for future conquest, smaller alien worlds who had lived for generations under the constant threat of a Corvette strike. These species, once too weak and divided to resist alone, found something in humanity's stubborn refusal to surrender that gave them the courage to fight alongside them instead of waiting to be conquered separately. Captain Bren Halden became a name whispered among Corvette officers long before most of them understood exactly who he was. He commanded a growing coalition fleet built from human ships and allied vessels of several other species, using tactics that Corvette war colleges had never studied, because no single species had ever fought quite like this combined force did. Instead of massive, predictable formations, Halden's fleet relied on speed, unpredictable strikes, and a willingness to retreat and regroup rather than hold a position at any cost, a strategy built on adaptability instead of pride. The results were catastrophic for the Corvette Directorate. Entire strike fleets sent to crush what were assumed to be weakened, desperate human forces were instead met with coordinated ambushes that destroyed ships faster than shipyards could replace them. Officers who once dismissed Doran's warnings as sentimental nonsense now found themselves studying his old reports in secret, searching for any insight that might explain what they were facing. Toma Rake arrived at the outpost during this period looking more shaken than Doran had ever seen him. He had just returned from a battle that Corvette Command was calling a strategic withdrawal in official reports. In reality, it had been a complete collapse of an entire fleet division. They knew our formations before we even arrived, Toma said, sitting heavily near the fueling controls. It was like fighting an enemy who had studied every mistake we were about to make before we made it. They probably did, Doran said quietly. Humans learn quickly, especially when the alternative is extinction. Every battle we win against them teaches them something. Every battle we lose reminds them why they cannot afford to stop. Back on the core Corvette worlds, the cost of the war could no longer be hidden from the public. Families demanded answers about missing relatives whose ships had supposedly returned home safely, according to official records that did not match reality. Protests, quiet at first, then increasingly open, began appearing across several major Corvette cities, questioning why a war promised to end quickly had instead stretched on for years with no clear victory in sight. Administrator Kessa Rowe responded the only way she knew how. She demanded harsher tactics. arguing that hesitation was the true cause of every failure, that mercy and caution had allowed the war to drag on this long. New orders were issued, targeting supply lines and civilian infrastructure more aggressively, a desperate attempt to force a quick surrender through overwhelming pressure instead of strategy. It had the opposite effect. Each harsher strike only strengthened the resolve of the growing human and allied coalition, giving them clearer reasons to keep fighting rather than negotiate. Colonies that might once have considered surrender under fair terms now fought with the same stubborn determination Doran had described years earlier in a chamber full of officers who refused to listen. During this period, copies of Doran's original report, the one dismissed as sentimental philosophy before the war even began circulating quietly among war-weary officers and a handful of journalists brave enough to question the official narrative. Nobody knew exactly how the report had spread beyond its original classified files, though Toma always suspected a few sympathetic officers who had grown tired of watching friends die for a strategy built on false confidence. Doran learned about this from a passing supply officer who recognized his name and asked, quietly, careful not to be overheard, whether he was the same Doran Vale who had predicted this outcome before the first shot was ever fired. He confirmed that he was. He did not celebrate the moment. There was no satisfaction in being right about a war that had already cost so many lives on both sides. Standing at the edge of the busy outpost, watching another wave of damaged ships limp into dock, he understood clearly that being right meant very little if it had come too late to prevent any of this from happening in the first place. The battle that finally ended the war was not the largest one fought, but it was the one that broke whatever confidence remained within the Corvette Directorate. A core battle fleet, sent to crush the growing human and allied coalition once and for all, was instead surrounded, outmaneuvered, and destroyed within a matter of hours. Captain Brenhalden's forces, supported by 3 allied species and a coordination system built from years of shared battle experience, did not simply win the engagement. They ended any illusion that the Corvette Directorate still held the advantage in this war. News of the defeat spread across Corvette worlds within days, impossible to hide behind careful wording or delayed announcements. Protests that had once been quiet grew loud and impossible to ignore. Government officials who had supported Administrator Kessa Rowe's strategy from the beginning suddenly found themselves distancing from her decisions, unwilling to share responsibility for a war that had cost so much and achieved so little. Within weeks, Kessa Rowe was formally removed from her position on the War Council. An emergency inquiry was launched, tasked with understanding exactly how a war promised to end quickly had instead brought the Corvette Directorate to the edge of collapse. Investigators searched through years of records, official reports, and classified files, looking for any warning that had been ignored before the first strike was ever launched. They found Doran's original report within the first week of searching. He was recalled from the outpost almost immediately, transported back to the same council chamber where he had once stood alone, the only officer to vote against a war that had since destroyed so much. The chamber looked the same as it had years earlier, cold and quiet, lit by pale blue light. This time, however, the officers seated around him did not look at him with dismissal. They looked at him with something closer to shame. "You warned this council exactly what would happen," the lead investigator said. "In detail, years before the first ship was ever launched. Why were your warnings ignored?" Doran considered the question carefully before answering. "Because fear is easier to believe than patience," he said. Administrator Kessa Rowe offered a simple story, one where humanity was a threat that needed to be destroyed quickly. I offered a complicated one, where understanding a species mattered more than fearing them. Simple stories are always easier to accept, especially when they confirm what people already want to believe. The inquiry did not end the war by itself, but it changed the direction of the Corvette Directorate completely. New leadership, desperate to avoid complete collapse, reached out through neutral channels to request formal peace negotiations with the human and allied coalition, the first real attempt at ending the war through discussion rather than continued destruction. Human representatives arrived weeks later aboard a modest diplomatic vessel, escorted by a small honor guard rather than a war fleet, a deliberate choice meant to show they had come to negotiate, not to conquer. Among them was Dr. Anna Cade. a human xenolinguist who had spent years studying Corveth communication patterns in preparation for exactly this moment, hoping desperately that it would eventually arrive. Before formal negotiations began, Dr. Cade made an unusual request. She asked to meet privately with the one Corveth officer who had refused to fight from the very beginning, whose name had appeared in translated reports circulating quietly among human intelligence analysts throughout the war. Doran met her in a small meeting room set aside for the negotiations, uncertain what to expect from a human he had only ever studied through old recordings and reports. She was calm, direct, and carried herself with the same careful patience he had noticed in countless human broadcasts over the years. "I read your original report," she said, sitting across from him. "The one about mercy winning more often than destruction. It took years for a translated copy to reach us, smuggled out through channels neither side fully controlled. I wanted to meet the person who wrote it before the negotiations began. It cost me everything to write it," Doran admitted. "And it still was not enough to stop any of this." "Maybe not at first," Anna said. "But it is the reason we are sitting here now instead of still fighting. Someone on your side understood us before we ever had the chance to prove it ourselves. That matters more than you think." Later that day, Doran met Captain Bren Halden for the first time, standing quietly near the negotiation chamber while officials from both sides prepared for the formal talks ahead. Halden studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I heard about the officer who refused to fight us before the first shot was even fired," Halden said. "I did not believe it was true until I read the reports myself." "I did not do it to be remembered," Doran said. "I did it because I could not justify destroying something I had spent 15 years learning to understand." Halden nodded slowly, something like respect settling into his expression. "That is exactly why this war is finally ending," he said. "Not because either side won completely, but because at least one person on your side was willing to understand us before deciding we deserve to die." The formal negotiations began the next morning, long and difficult, filled with disagreements neither side expected to resolve easily. But for the first time since the war began, both sides sat across from each other with the intention of building something lasting, rather than simply deciding who would destroy the other first. 10 years after the peace treaty was signed, a small garden existed on a shared space station orbiting the border between Corveth and human territory, planted with flowers from both worlds growing side by side in soil brought from each civilization. It was not the kind of monument most people expected after such a long and costly war. There were no statues of great commanders, no massive displays of military strength. Instead, there was simply a quiet garden and a single stone marker at its center, engraved with words taken directly from an old report once dismissed as sentimental nonsense. Doran visited that garden often, though he no longer needed to travel far to reach it. After the peace treaty was finalized, he had been formally reinstated within the Corveth Directorate, not to a position of military command, but to something he found far more meaningful. He became the lead advisor on interspecies relations, tasked with ensuring that the mistakes made before and during the war were never repeated with any other species the Directorate encountered in the future. He accepted the honors given to him with quiet discomfort, always careful to remind anyone who congratulated him that the true courage belonged to others. To Tomarake, who had risked his career sharing frontline truths when silence would have been far safer. To the countless officers who had quietly passed his old report through unofficial channels, refusing to let the truth stay buried no matter the personal risk. To Dr. Anna Cade and Captain Bren Halden, who had chosen negotiation over continued destruction even after everything the war had cost them. Tomarake had become something unexpected himself, serving now as one of the primary liaisons between Corveth and human worlds, using the hard lessons learned on the front lines to help prevent future conflicts before they could ever begin. He often joked that he owed his entire career to a commander who once refused a direct order in front of an entire ship's crew, though there was always real gratitude behind the joke. The official Corveth historical archives had been rewritten as well, a slow and sometimes uncomfortable process for a civilization forced to confront years of carefully constructed propaganda. Doran's refusal, once recorded as an act of cowardice meant to shame him publicly, was now taught in Corveth academies as an example of moral clarity under enormous pressure, a reminder that following orders blindly was never the same as serving one's people well. Administrator Kessa Rowe lived out the remainder of her years in quiet obscurity, stripped of influence, but never formally punished beyond her removal from power. History had already delivered its own judgment on her decisions, one far more permanent than any official punishment could have provided. Doran never spoke about her with anger, only with a tired kind of understanding, recognizing that fear had shaped her choices just as thoroughly as patience had shaped his own. Standing in the garden one quiet afternoon, Doran was joined by Anna Cade, who now split her time between human and Corveth worlds as part of the ongoing diplomatic efforts between both civilizations. She looked at the stone marker at the center of the garden, reading the familiar words carved into it, the same ones Doran had once spoken in a cold council chamber to officers who refused to listen. "Do you ever think about how differently this could have gone?" she asked. "If they had listened to you the first time?" Doran considered the question carefully, the same way he considered most things. "Every day," he admitted. "But I try not to dwell on the war that could have been avoided. I try to focus on what we build now, so the next warning is not so easily ignored." Anna nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Not far from where they stood, a group of young Corveth students toured the garden as part of a history lesson, listening carefully as their instructor explained the story behind the memorial, the officer who refused to fight a war built on fear instead of truth, and the long, difficult path that eventually led to lasting peace between two very different species. One of the students, curious and unafraid to ask questions, looked toward Doran, not yet realizing who he was standing near. "Do you think he knew he was right?" the student asked their instructor. "Back then, when everyone else disagreed with him?" The instructor smiled, glancing briefly toward Doran before answering. "I think he hoped he was right," she said. "But hoping is not the same as knowing. Sometimes the bravest choice a person can make is standing by what they believe, even when they cannot be certain history will ever prove them correct." Doran said nothing, listening quietly from a distance, the garden around him blooming with flowers from two worlds that had once been ready to destroy each other completely. He thought back to that broken human recording he used to play during his years at the listening station, the one about hope during a storm, and understood now, more clearly than ever, why he had never been able to turn it off completely. Some truths took years to be believed, but once proven, they had a way of lasting far longer than the fear that had once tried to bury them.